welcome. My name is Dr Emma Milne. I'm a member of the board of the Socio-Legal Studies Association, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Seán Columb today, who's going to be talking about his book, Trading Life, Organ Trafficking, Illicit Networks and Exploitation. Seán won the Hart SLSA Prize for Early Career Academics in 2001. Thanks for joining me today, Seán.
Thanks, Emma.
So I wonder if we could just start by you providing me with an overview of the publication.
Yeah, I can give you a very short overview, and then we can get into it a bit more when you start asking some more questions. But basically, the book is about the emergence and evolution of the organ trade in Cairo, Egypt. I wanted to get an understanding of how the organ trade was facilitated and organized, and I wanted to understand why people felt compelled to sell a kidney to begin with. And I guess more importantly, from a regulatory point of view, I wanted to understand what kind of impact criminal legislation was having on the organ trade and how those dynamics affected the people involved. So really at the heart of the book is the narratives of the people that I spoke to. And the book's about trying to understand their perspective and use their perspective to inform the law and to assess the law. And that's basically it. But we can get into it in more detail as you ask more questions.
Excellent. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating book. I enjoyed it immensely reading it. I think one of the things that I found to be, and that came out really clearly in the book that was central, was your methodological approach and the way in which you needed to really think about how were you going to approach the research to ensure you got the richness of data that informs your analysis. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so for me, like the most important thing was always about trying to speak to people who were directly affected by the organ trade. And the only way to do that was to go to a country that had been identified as having an active organ trade and try and speak to people, which wasn't that easy to begin with. And to be honest, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that, but it was important. So like to begin with, I looked at the legislation, I looked at all the kind of background responses or legal responses to the organ trade, but the only way to assess how they were actually having an impact and how they were affecting people in different ways was to try and reach out to the people involved. So really what I wanted to do with the book was to bear witness to the stories of people who were compelled for different reasons to consider selling a kidney. But I also wanted to understand it from the perspective of brokers if possible, just to know why they do what it is that they do, but also to understand a bit more the dynamics involved with the organ trade and how it connects to the transplant industry as well. That was important, and how demand was generated. And I guess the story I was trying to tell or understand was how law and policy can sometimes indirectly produce violence against people. And the majority of people that I spoke to, I wanted to understand how they became or how they were positioned as organ sellers to begin with. So for me, that was really important. And the major reason I went to Egypt is, one, it was identified as a hotspot of organ trafficking by the World Health Organization. But I was reading reports about asylum seekers and refugees in particular being targeted for their organs. But with these reports, there was only really like a line or two saying refugees are being targeted, but there was no explanation as to why. And there was never any kind of perspective given from any of the people who had actually been targeted for a kidney, or actually forced into a position where they had to consider doing that. So for me, the methodology, the most important thing was to do ethnographic fieldwork if possible. But to be honest, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that to begin with. So I kind of just threw myself out there. I started off by contacting maybe 60 different NGOs, but most of the responses I got, they would refer me to news stories that had been reproduced online over the last maybe 5 or 6 years. So I'd see different stories that would come up in kind of slightly different forms from 2014 onwards, that would talk about kidneys being harvested in the Sinai, or talk about kind of back alley organ trafficking. But the human story was never there. That was always missing, the perspective of the person involved, the people involved. And then that's the kind of gap I wanted to bridge. So for me, the only way to achieve this was to go to a country like Egypt that had been identified and to try and reach people involved. So basically what I did was, it was a bit of serendipity involved too. So I reached out to NGOs, but I didn't always get a strong response by email. It's always better to be there in person. But even in person, I was kind of told, or maybe, I guess it's sort of a taboo topic in Egypt and in many countries. but there was some sensitivity involved with the organ trade before the revolution as well. I guess the organ trade was seen as another indictment of a corrupt political system. So before the revolution in 2011, a new law was introduced in 2010. And this was the law that I really wanted to assess and see how that affected or changed the dynamics of the trade. So when I got to Cairo, I reached out to different NGOs, and they told me that the organ trade was a problem, but it's now improved since the law was introduced, that there was now much better law enforcement, and this issue was on the radar of the government, and it was being taken seriously. But I had still seen a lot of reports coming out, and I was hearing from locals, taxi drivers, for example, that there was an active trade. So I went to one particular NGO, and they told me that they could only say a very limited amount of things about the organ trade, because this was an area that they didn't really have permission to talk about. So there's laws in Egypt and in some other countries as well that kind of restrict what NGOs can report on. So to get permission to work in that country, they can only work on a particular issue. And the organ trade wasn't an issue that any NGO that I spoke to had permission to discuss or report on, or to assist people who had been fallen victim to it in different ways. But like I said, there was a lot of serendipity involved. So one NGO, an interpreter heard me speaking, and she advised me to go to the communities themselves. So she told me about certain areas in the city where I could go and where I could try and talk to people and get their perspective, which is exactly what I wanted to do. But again, I was a bit concerned, how am I going to do this? I'm just going to go to an area and then start asking people very sensitive questions. That's not going to really work. But basically what I did is I went to a number of different street markets, and I sat there for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. I got talking to some people, and I genuinely enjoyed myself and the people that I was speaking to. And there was one person in particular who opened up to me, and I call him Solomon in the book. Obviously, that's a pseudonym, and I've used pseudonyms the whole way throughout the book to protect people's confidentiality. But he was really important in linking me to people who had been involved in different ways. And when I first spoke to Solomon, he told me he didn't know a lot about the organ trade, but as we got speaking and he understood my motivations for this, basically that I wanted to learn from the perspectives of people involved, and I wanted to maybe take their stories and use their stories to help inform legal practice, he was very much on board. But after maybe 2 or 3 weeks of sitting in this particular street market, I won't say where it was exactly, I was introduced to someone who sold a kidney, and a sort of snowball from there. I guess I spoke, most of the interviews that I had, they could last maybe, between 2 or 3 hours, but sometimes days. And I've been going back for maybe close to 6 years, 7 years. And I built up a lot of trust and rapport with the people that I spoke to. And I ended up living with Solomon most of the time when I went back. So people knew how to reach me and how to contact me. And I think without that level of trust and rapport, this would have been impossible. So they very much saw me not just as a researcher, but as an ally and someone that could help tell their story. And people were happy to talk about that. So I think that was absolutely key, because it's a question I get asked a lot of times by journalists, for example, as well. But I think having the time and being with the people that I was working with and talking to made a huge difference.
Yeah, and that really comes out in the book, and it's quite clear that your participants had a huge amount of trust in you and were giving you information that they potentially wouldn't be giving to anybody else. I wonder if you could just talk through some of the ethical issues you faced and how you addressed those, because it's really clear from the book that you were very sensitive in how you managed this research and you ensured protection for yourself and for those who participated. So I think it's really good for us as a socio-legal community to be really reflexive on our methodological approach and the ethical implications. And I think your study does that really beautifully. So I'm sure members of the community would love to hear about some of the things you were thinking about as you were doing the research.
Yeah, well, safety and the sensitivity of the topic was very much in the foreground of my mind during the research. But the people that I spoke to, they interviewed me before I interviewed them most of the time. So they had a strong sense of who I was before we even talked about issues like the organ trade. And they understood that I wanted not just to talk about illicit organ removal, but how they got positioned or how they were in a situation where they had to consider doing that to begin with. So what most people wanted to communicate to me was how that had happened, why they felt the need to sell a kidney, or how they were positioned in a vulnerable place where they could be exploited in different ways. So for most of the interviews, like I said, they were very casual, and I was very concerned that I didn't want to be followed. I know this sounds a little bit paranoid, but I've spoken to researchers before I went to Cairo and to Egypt about their experiences. So I knew I had to be careful about certain things, and particularly about protecting the people that I spoke to, but also myself. But most of the interviews took place in people's homes where they were comfortable. And like I said, they wouldn't necessarily take place over, it wasn't a case where I'd sit down and ask questions nonstop for 2 hours. Like, these questions would come over the period of maybe 2 or 3 hours, over dinner, after dinner. We'd stop and pick up again when things got too heavy. And it was generally always in people's homes. And because people were sort of connected, and I'm mostly the most people that I spoke to, they were referred by somebody else. There was always that kind of environment of trust, if that makes sense. So that was really important, and that put me at ease, and it put the people at ease that I spoke to as well. But obviously, not all of the interviews were with kidney sellers. When it came to speaking to organ brokers, I had to take other precautions as well. And for my own safety, when I spoke to organ brokers who did learn of my research and wanted to talk to me and figure out what I was doing and why I was doing it, we always spoke in the open. I thought that was important. So it depended on the people that I was speaking to and the issues that were being discussed. But in general, when I spoke to kidney sellers, that was generally at their homes. Whenever I spoke to someone who was involved in brokering or arranging for the sale or purchase of a kidney, that was done in public. That was usually done in an open space where there was a lot of people around in case something went wrong, not that it ever did. And also, when I spoke to transplant professionals, that was generally done at their offices or place of work. I spoke to people at dialysis centers as well. So basically, the key thing was to make sure that people were comfortable, and not to, a little bit of intuition kicked in as well, not to ask questions that made people feel uncomfortable, but even particularly when I was speaking to people involved in criminal activities, not to press too much and just to let people talk. So that was really important as well. I didn't ask too many questions. A lot of the time when I was speaking to a broker, for example, they would just, I would let them give their perspective without trying to show any kind of opinion as such. And that was important too. So there's some of the things I did, but otherwise, in terms of where I stayed, the first visit was for about 3 months. Then the next visit was a bit shorter, but I think going back and forth also helped. I think if I was there for one long period of time, I might have maybe raised some suspicions or concerns about what it was that I was doing. But also, I thought like accommodation was important. I think I always felt safe because, again, I built up a strong friendship with one person in particular, Solomon, who acted as a gatekeeper, but also helped as an interpreter and a research participant himself. But living with the Sudanese community or the people that I built that kind of friendship and rapport with to begin with, that really helped as well. And that helped me feel safe. So generally I would stay in a hotel for the first night, and then I would move and stay with the people that I was working with and that I was trying to talk to and engage with.
Yeah, excellent. That's really interesting. And I think the study it's such an excellent example of socio-legal research that has some serious risks involved, but how beautifully it can be done and safely it can be done, or safe as possible. You can't mitigate all risk, obviously, but as safe as possible. And the result really is just fantastic in terms of the analysis that you put forward in the book and you present. One of the key things I just wanted us to pick up on and to think about more and to get your thoughts on is, it becomes clear from the analysis that you present throughout the book that attempts by the international community to prevent harm through the trafficking of people actually has had this impact of increasing the harm through illegal organ donation, or trafficking might perhaps be a better word. Maybe you might want to talk about the distinction in terms there and their importance. But I was just wondering what you think the research tells us about the role of international bodies in terms of preventing harm to vulnerable groups such as refugees and migrants.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to try and be kind here. So yeah, there was a clear reason why asylum seekers and refugees were being targeted for organ sale. The majority of people that I spoke to, they came to Cairo to register with the UNHCR. Most people were told, okay, you can have asylum, and they were given a yellow card. Then they were told to wait for a period of time before they have a refugee status determination meeting. And there was no clear criteria involved in that. Nobody really knew what that actually meant. Maybe months could go by, years could go by before they actually had that meeting. And when they had that meeting, the refugee status didn't really mean a lot to them. Most of the people that I spoke to just felt that when they got refugee status, that they were immobilized and they couldn't move anywhere, and they didn't really have any access to work. And it was actually, most of the people that I spoke to didn't get trafficked into Cairo. They came to Egypt looking for assistance, looking for resettlement, hoping that they could be moved to a country where they could have better opportunities for a better life. But a lot of the people that I spoke to, even with the refugee status, they just felt like after maybe a period of time that there was no other way to help themselves than to maybe consider getting out of the country in some way. So a lot of my latter work and the work that I'm doing now was looking at that kind of relationships between different kind of illicit networks and how they developed as informal economic activities into organized crime. So what happened was, with a lot of the people that I spoke to, they didn't receive any support or any meaningful support from the UNCR or for any of its partner organizations. And then they were kind of targeted by brokers and different types of intermediaries who offer them different kind of extra legal services to support them in different ways. So it was almost like an alternative support network. And I'll give one particular story. So I think this is the best way to do this, is to speak about some of the people that I actually spoke to instead of generalizing, because everyone had a slightly different experience. But for example, one man from Eritrea that I spoke to, he was only about 19 years of age. He escaped from Sawa military camp. He was in Kassala refugee camp where the conditions were atrocious. So he escaped again, went to Khartoum, found some informal work, saved a little bit, came to Cairo looking for work as a destination, but there wasn't any work really available to him. And then he was approached by someone who told him that if he sold a kidney, he would make a lot of money. He could use this money to travel to Europe if needs be, send money back home to his family to help them out, and he'd also save a life. So it sounded like a very good deal for him. But in actuality, he wasn't paid what he was promised. He didn't receive any aftercare, and the person who promised to help him and assist him to get to Europe disappeared soon afterwards, after the surgery was actually completed. But what I found was that the laws regulating the organ trade was actually working against people rather than for them. So Dawit, for example, this person I'm speaking about, and this is again is a pseudonym, as with many of the other participants in the research, when they went and sought out assistance, they were told one of two things. First of all, you're either an asylum seeker or a refugee, so you're not the responsibility of the Egyptian state. You need to go to the UNHCR. And they did go to the UNHCR many times, I was told, but apparently they didn't receive any assistance. And when I spoke to members of the UNHCR, I was told that the organ trade wasn't necessarily a problem in Egypt, even though I had been speaking to people for months, if not years, who had told me about their experiences and what had happened to them. So they were told, first of all, that it wasn't the responsibility of the state. Second, they were told that if they didn't have refugee status or if that had lapsed. So a lot of people that I spoke to had refugee status, but after a period of time, if they didn't register and give their address, and people didn't give their address simply because they didn't have a permanent address, they lost their refugee status, which was ridiculous, that they were illegal. And if they were legal, actually, that they should be arrested. Now, the third thing people were being told was that it's illegal to buy or sell a kidney. Now, if you sell your kidney and you're not exploited or not recognized as being exploited, that means you're potentially committed a criminal act. So people were being silenced through the law. And actually, the brokers were using that as leverage as well. So brokers would tell people, if you change your mind, you've been engaged in a criminal activity, we will report you to the police and you will be arrested as well. So the law was working against people. And from what I could see, it was pushing the trade further underground. It also gave a bit more control and power to the intermediaries. So before the law was introduced in 2010, there was still an organ trade, but people would go directly to the hospitals, which was still exploitative. But when the law was introduced, some of the transplant professionals who were performing these surgeries knowingly for payment, they started to work with groups of intermediaries or recruiters who would seek out people who were in a vulnerable position, basically, people who were in financial need, who were selling a kidney as an economic option of last resort. So that's what was happening. So the law really made things worse. And then in terms of the kind of, on a more macro level, the crime and immigration controls that were coming into play because of the European agenda on migration. Egypt plays a very strategic role in that as well, and has received a lot of money from the European Union, as has Libya, to control migration. That's made conditions much worse for asylum seekers and for refugees who feel contained, and through that containment feel more restricted than ever, and are forced to consider doing things that they would never want to do. For example, selling a kidney or taking a dangerous journey through the Sahara Desert. These are things people would never want to do if they had actual support or meaningful support.
It's so tragic, these cases, because as you've made really clear, they're incredibly vulnerable people, and then the system just seems to be against them. And I think one of the key things about your book that I really came away thinking about was a broader question around what role should the law play in terms of protecting people. So thinking about, should we criminalize something to protect them? Does that work? Or actually, do we need to decriminalize something? Does that work? Your book makes some really key and important points there. I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think the key message from the book is that vulnerable people, they need support, not incrimination. A lot of the people that I spoke to, they weren't aware of the law to begin with, and they were only made aware of the law around organ sales after they've already been victimized in some way. And then again, obviously, when they heard about the law was being used against them, not for them. So people only knew that it was illegal to sell a kidney when they tried to receive assistance from different types of authorities, whether it was international organizations who were not allowed to work on this issue, or from state authorities like the police. So that was a problem. And for most people that I spoke to, they were only in this position because they didn't receive any kind of support to begin with. So a lot of the people that I spoke to came from countries that were in conflict: South Sudan, Darfur area, Eritrea, Ethiopia. They had come seeking assistance. And over a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, without any sort of assistance or any access to the labor markets, they were in a more vulnerable position than they had been beforehand. And they also had debts as well, depending on how they got to the country to begin with. Or because a lot of people, the only way to claim asylum is to go through a smuggler, which is crazy. There was no legal channels or no legal pathways to claim asylum. So they had to use alternative routes, which again exposed them to more harm and exploitation. Or the possibility of exploitation in different ways. So what people wanted to communicate to me from the very beginning wasn't, they didn't really want to talk about the act of organ removal in and of itself, but why or how they had come to that position to begin with, where they were being targeted, or where they were being forced, or where they were exposed to the level of exploitation that by any means or any stretch of the imagination is actual human trafficking. So some people that I spoke to had much more harrowing accounts than Dawood, for example, which no doubt he was exploited, but some people were physically coerced as well. So for most people, what they wanted to say to me is, or what they wanted to communicate, was the need for assistance. So a lot of the people that I spoke to who sold a kidney were single mothers. If they had childcare, they would have been able to take a job. They couldn't pay for accommodation. They did have some temporary accommodation for 2 months, but nothing afterwards. And then they couldn't afford things. Obviously, cost of living has gone up everywhere, but it's been a particular problem in Egypt for a long time now. So that was a major issue. They didn't really receive any kind of monetary assistance from the UN, just a small stipend that didn't really make a huge difference for them. So even in terms of education, they had no access to education. So for most people, what they said to me is that what they really needed was access to housing, access to education, maybe some kind of child support, and I say this paradoxically, but access to health. So just to give you an example, one person that I spoke to, he sold his kidney because his mother needed to get a surgery that he couldn't afford any other way. So that was happening as well. And then I think the other thing to think about is, like, this is also an issue of global health inequality as well. So from the other side, from some of the patients that I spoke to, they were coming from countries that had no access to transplantation and that didn't have universal healthcare. So they had to travel overseas. So not all the patients that I spoke to were affluent, wealthy people. They were also in a difficult situation as well. and they had no choice but to travel overseas to receive transplant surgery. And most of the time, this was being offered in private clinics. So I think it's also a question of public health and public health funding as well. So I see all of this money, absolute like millions. I think the Libya received in 2017, 91 million for border enforcement and to build or construct detention centers. Some of that money, even if a fraction of that money was used to support people in need, people wouldn't fall into situations where they have to consider selling a kidney. So I think that's the kind of key message from the book, is that more support is needed. And criminal law, it can act as a deterrent, but it's very limited in what it can do.
Yeah, some really important messages there, I think, coming out of your book for this topic, but also I think more broadly in terms of the role of the criminal law. So just my final question is to really ask you about your future research. Where are you going now that the book came out? I think it was 2001, wasn't it? So it's been out for a while. So what's happening next? Yeah,
2020. So yeah, at the moment, I'm looking at the convergence of illicit networks along the central Mediterranean routes. So basically, I'm trying to understand how different types of groups come together and how organized crime is developed from informal economic activities. So that's the kind of work I'm looking at. So I'm picking up on some of the areas that I covered in the book, but going into that in a deeper sense. So that will involve maybe travel back to Sudan and maybe some more research in Egypt as well. But for me, at the heart of all the research that I do, it's important to talk to people who are affected by these different laws and policies, and then to use their perspectives to help kind of inform or critique the law in some way. And I think I guess that's a key approach for socio-legal research in general, to understand the human story and to understand how law can affect people in sometimes negative ways also. So I guess it builds on that theme of really how law can, under certain conditions, generate violence.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds like incredibly needed research. So thank you very much for joining me today. Many congratulations on the book. It really is an absolute wonderful read. I would encourage everybody to read it. And congratulations on the prize.
Thank you very much.